Aaron. Paul was born in Aurora, Colorado in 1993. He received his BFA from Syracuse University in 2015. His primary focus is a form of abstract painting that is imbued with political and social meaning, simultaneously riffing on neo-expressionism and post-conceptual painting. He's also a conceptual sculptor. I'm not going to go any more into it because I'm not going to give it away, so to speak. And Aaron is an independent curator, museum professional, lecturer, and arts consultant who's worked on a multitude of platforms within the public, private, and corporate arts communities, nationally and internationally. He regularly contributes to essays. He wrote Paul's essay today and lectures all over the country. So we're going to turn it over to Paul and Aaron. Paul is going to walk us through the exhibition, and then these two are going to have a conversation. Aaron has been following Paul's work for about 5 years, so he's very familiar with the work, where it's been, and where it's going.
Yeah.
Okay?
Thank you.
So I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, so let's start over here, I think. So these abstract works I've been making for about 2 or 3 years now. What was interesting with making these pieces specifically is that I kind of started using these charcoal sticks, which are about the same size as my arm. And at first it was really very playful. It's sort of like an expressive, almost dance. And then I started realizing that they were very kind of violent works and that I hadn't even really noticed that as I was making them. And I feel like that in a lot of ways connects with the culture that we live in. And so you'll see them, they're just kind of stapled up on the wall. I wanted to leave them very raw. They kind of become these like abstractions that aren't necessarily like pristine objects. And so moving along over here, we have these flag monoprint paintings where I've rolled down many layers of latex paint onto the American flag, straight onto the flag, and then I'll push it onto the canvas and then press it down onto the actual, these are actually tarps. So you get this basically print of the flag that pulls up in a very abstract way. And so in a lot of ways, these works are about the flag, but they're also about abstraction. They're about kind of moving an intersection between my charcoal works, which are very abstract, and then into this more conceptual spot about America and what these symbols that we see every day mean and how they are abstracted for us as well. I think a lot of the time when we look at the flag, things are so deeply embedded into us about how we grew up that it's hard to even see the thing and like be critical maybe, or also look at it for like the literal like kind of formal elements of the flag. And so these works kind of let that sing a little bit. Kind of takes away that barrier between people and the symbol itself. We have a couple more of those charcoal works. So I'm thinking of these as really sort of an abstract representation of the violent theme that sort of follows this entire show, which you'll see as we kind of come over here into the sculptures. So this piece against the wall is about the Aurora theater shooting, which I'd made paintings for a long time, about 3 or 4 years about. And actually with Aaron, we'd at Long Road Projects, I'd spent some time with him making those works. And so this is the newest iteration of those. They're sculptures. So for this piece, they were, basically I found the receipts for the Aurora theater shooters, James Holmes, his preparation for the shooting. And so these actual targets are the same targets, but exactly the same way, shipped from the company that he bought all of that from. And so he bought these massive just amounts of targets and other kinds of target-related detritus to make kind of a like a target range, like a shooting range kind of practice area. And so those works are then juxtaposed against this flag, which the flagpole is covered in stickers from various different kind of corporate offsets of like weapons manufacturers. And so it follows this theme from what does it mean on the micro level that we're having these mass shootings in America, and what does it then mean that there's mass like corporate profit being made off of like these international wars? And in a lot of ways, they're being funded in the same way. They're kind of funneled through these companies like Smith & Wesson, or alternatively Raytheon, or in a different way, you have Halliburton, which made so much money in Iraq and Afghanistan, not necessarily even just on arms sales. And then coming back around over here, actually, we have these oil paintings. And so I kind of thought of these works as a way to escape from the kind of information overload that we're always hit with. I think that so many of us feel overwhelmed at times like these, where you have very contentious politics, and the digital kind of realm has changed so many things about the way that we digest politics. So you'll see within these works, it's almost easy to get sucked into a void, kind of like a black hole, where you can just like fall into the formal qualities of the painting. So some of these will be titled like Fentanyl, I think was one of them, and another one is like The Great Outdoors, and you also have like Big Macs, or so it's this like way of escaping, and the different people escape in different ways, and we have all kinds of different vices. But really these works are, I see them as that same kind of escapism. And then you kind of follow that around in through these oil paintings, which follow a similar kind of trajectory. So the show is titled Market Forces, which in some ways is a play on words kind of connected back to the actual literal forces you see like in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then also market forces within the art world. And so I kind of wanted to play around with this idea of minimalism as sort of a bargaining chip, or of something that people trade, really more of a trading chip. It's something that people kind of like use abstraction in that way to sell art. And so I found myself eventually getting to this work, Too Hot, which I think of as sort of like flash sale or something. These are like, maybe these objects are too hot. They're like maybe like sexy things that are like easily consumed, and that people like to own these things because they don't necessarily make you like think or like push you in any direction. And so I'm trying to load that both with this conceptual information, but also at the same time with this kind of abstraction that does let you also escape. And moving on from those, we kind of have this array of sculptures. So hanging from the ceiling on the chain is a uniform. So it's a bulletproof vest from Blackwater, which is a mercenary group that has made incredible amounts of money. It's tied to Eric Prince. And so then from there, you have also a pile of honey. So this honey is Yemeni Sadir honey, which is one of Yemen's greatest exports, and it's filled with toy guns. So one of the problems with the honey in Yemen right now is that they can't export it out of Yemen because they're basically in the middle of a genocide through Saudi Arabia, which is being funded in a lot of ways by our own military-industrial complex in the United States, which is kind of bringing in companies like Raytheon, and they're basically pumping these guns into Saudi Arabia, making tons of arms sales, incredible amount of money. And then we move on to this Fanta bottle. And so this Fanta bottle is kind of the oldest probably representation I have of this corporate power run amok in some way surrounding the military and around war. So Fanta was created essentially because in Nazi Germany they didn't have access to a lot of the materials that they needed to actually produce Coca-Cola. And so Fanta was originally like the offset of Coca-Cola for Nazi Germany during the war. And after the war, Coca-Cola still swooped in and took all of those profits. And so they made an incredible amount of money off of essentially World War II. And you can kind of see that they were on both sides of the war. They were like putting out these advertisements in the United States where it says like, come home to a Coca-Cola, and at the same time you have the same thing happening in Nazi Germany, just with Fanta. And so I filled this bottle, which was found in a trench. It's from 1941, and it's filled with current day Fanta. Fanta remains one of the largest actual subsidiaries of like Coca-Cola especially in Europe. It's really popular. Largely actually because after the war they were able to continue on with some of the factories that had already been built there. And so then moving on from that, we have this magazine called Soldier of Fortune, which the owner of this magazine, whose initials are RBK, he was one of the vice presidents of the NRA at one point. And so I also have these covered with these clay ducks, which or NRA clay ducts, so they have kind of all kinds of printing on them from that to identify spots within the magazine, which is the Soldier of Fortune magazine for mercenaries, where lots of classified ads were being put out that essentially you'll have like people who say, oh, I was like ex-CIA, or I was in Vietnam, and now I really am like hard up for money a lot of the time, or they like, we're putting out these advertisements where they say I'm a bounty hunter, or I'm willing to fight wherever you want me to fight, just give me the right price, essentially is what it amounts to. And eventually these classified ads got totally erased from existence because you had a legal fight over them after too many actual incidents were happening in the United States where there were bounty hunters basically finding work through this magazine. Moving on to this final piece over here, you have two Geo Group cufflinks, which Geo Group is the company that runs the immigrant detention centers. And they're sitting on top of a bed of shells from Tool Lake internment camp that were collected in the 40s. And so you have this kind of juxtaposition of kind of internment for profit that we're having now. And looking back on the United States history, kind of a way to sort of prove that these things are American and that they've sort of happened over time, and that it's not so isolated within the time that we live, although maybe it's exacerbated, but that there's things that have happened over time that we need to also deal with as a society. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this group of works. So maybe we'll start yeah.
Okay, so I figure what we'll do is kind of talk about, I mean, you gave some insights into this body of work, but I think what we should kind of rewind a little bit and talk about your broader body of work as a jumping off point and how you got to this point.
Right.
So I wanted to kind of kick off by saying, do you consider your studio practice and these multiple bodies of work one cohesive, linear journey, or do you see it as non-linear in that, you're revolving around spheres of concepts and things, but are they all related? Yeah. Or how did your studio practice come about? Right. I guess is where
I think in a lot of ways, yeah. I think that's a good question. I think that they really are interrelated. I mean, so when you first met me, we were working with these pieces that were basically redacted paintings of the legal documents for the Aurora theater shooter. And so I was following this case very directly, and I was concerned with what it meant that there was so much censorship of what we could learn about what had happened there. And sort of how do you learn from it without having like direct access to that information? Which eventually that information actually flowed out in droves once the actual trial began. But there were so many like years actually, I think, where there were just redacted, really like totally illegible, like censored pages. Just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And so I was making those paintings, and those were really the beginning of all of this. It got me thinking about like what it means to live in a society where we have, at the same time, massive amounts of violence happening in our own country and what's happening abroad, and how we're maybe sponsoring those things, or how our culture really revolves around that. And then to have all of that kind of sink into me, I think that's how the abstract painting comes about, is that I'm kind of following all of this information, as I think most of us are on a daily basis now. There's like an incredible amount of media out there, and you kind of have to digest so much of it. People have like, almost like watching like different movies or something, or they don't really know what's going on in each other's heads anymore. So I think, because we've just seen so much different information from person to person, that I think that's where these paintings kind of come from, is this like overwhelming amount of information and so much violent information that we see like on a daily basis. And so they're maybe not aesthetically so directly similar all the time, but I do think they come out of the same kind of realm. You know, they're kind of, and once you're in that flow of kind of seeing which paintings connect in which ways, you can kind of walk around this room and you kind of feel that, yeah, these are from the same world, or these kind of come in from where I live, and I've lived inside of this thing that I think we all are here together in now. Yeah.
So, I mean, do you see that as this new wave of American idealism through the availability of media? Everyone gets their own source. Everyone receives the information that they choose to receive versus factual evidence, things like that. And not casting stones or placing blame on either side of the coin, because there are extremes on both ends. Do you see that as a truly American identity facing element, or is this a global?
I think it's global, but I also think that, you know, there's so many different media opportunities happening today that you almost also have social media and YouTube, and so it's like we're all watching not even just MSNBC or Fox or CNN or whatever, which are all also, you know, corporate owned, and so they have their own kind of agenda too. And so you kind of, I mean, you can't really expect Bloomberg News to say something negative about Michael Bloomberg. It's not going to happen. Or it might happen, but it'll be very limited. It's in just the right way. And so when you look at this whole like news landscape, I think we're living in a time where it's really scary to try to get your news, because none of us really know what to trust. And on the one hand, you have maybe people who are trying to tell the truth, and maybe they're online and they're on YouTube or something. And at the same time, you have people who are probably also trying to tell the truth in the news media. And the question is, which truth is your truth, and why are these people maybe hired to tell the truth in a certain way, whereas like, or there's a certain truth to a certain type of demographic too.
Well, do you think that leads
different from other
to,
people's.
do you think that leads to a lack of desire to hear the true news, or notions of a desire for validation of one's individual viewpoint?
I think both, but I also think the question of what is true news is important. And how can we get to something that actually is factual, but at the same time, you see so many things that are loaded with just political content, kind of like partisan political content, which in a lot of ways is just drama that surrounds all of these issues. You don't hear so much about, like, for instance, healthcare, or you won't hear so much about like the military-industrial complex, or, I mean, it's really, you won't hear those things on a lot of the news. A lot of the time it's really just this back and forth. And it's really about like impeachment, or it's about, say, Benghazi, or it's like you have these sort of like things that dominate the news in a way that it doesn't necessarily get at the direct issues. And to talk about
that's a
personas.
result of the anonymity, online anonymity, to where people can just kind of have their notions and their ideas and run with it on the online platform, but, you know, in the public realm where online is maybe, you know, it's public in a sense, but anyone can make a persona. So, I mean, how do you see anonymity playing into that as it relates to the objects that you were able to procure through these companies being anonymous and delivering, you know, targets and flak jackets and things like that that are readily available for American consumption?
Right. I think that's actually quite interesting. So the idea that we can kind of confront these objects that exist that maybe aren't even directly guns, they're just like the preparatory like targets that you maybe need to be able to practice to do a shooting. it's very interesting to then like see these objects that I don't think a lot of us confront, or if we do, it's at an actual shooting range, or it's like, and there's
Sanctioned
something, yeah,
spaces.
there's sanctioned spaces, and so to look actually back at that idea of anonymity. So when I was making these works, the Aurora piece specifically, I mean, it arrived in this totally anonymous box, which is like, it's just this cardboard thing with nothing, no marks on it at all. You could have been toys, it could have been anything that was in there. And so to really like know that that's the same way that it arrived at James Holmes's apartment, and that, you know, like, how are you gonna know? I mean, nobody knows what's in that box. And I had no idea what was in that box. I was like, oh, well, what's this thing that's coming from Minneapolis? I've ordered a lot of things, like it could have been anything. And I'm opening it up and I'm like, oh, well, these are the targets that I ordered, yeah. And so I think that there's this anonymity of objects too, that, you know, like when you're buying things on eBay, or that's also how I was able to acquire the flak jacket there, which is that you can really just buy it. It's like $80. It's a quick little like impulse buy, if that's the way to put it. You know, and so that's a very dangerous way to live.
Do you think that that's truly American, impulse buy? Do you think that that
Well, I
is
think
a
impulse buy is
symptom
highly
of-
American, yeah. And looking back at like the idea of market forces, I mean, yeah, you don't get any more market forces than that. You make anything cheap, and it's accessible.
So, kind of talking about market and agenda of market and
Yeah.
things like that, I want to rewind a little bit as it pertains to the coining of the phrase, the military-industrial complex. So, in 1961, Dwight Eisenhower more or less warned the American people as he was vacating office of the military-industrial complex. I'll read a quote. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for this disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. So this was about 5 years into U.S. occupation within Vietnam.
Yeah.
That conflict, though, so let me rewind. So Eisenhower came after Truman, of course. Truman was the president that decided to drop the atomic bomb. So he's coming on the heels of probably, if not the most catastrophic event in humankind, you know, the human race, in a militaristic element. After that happened, Eisenhower takes office, and then Vietnam and the fight against Red Scare and communism as a whole. The 20 years of American involvement in Vietnam lasted through 5 presidents, which is pretty interesting, I find. And so do you think that it was this American global policing type scenario that was birthed from that, and that maybe it was an inception, this idea of the military-industrial complex was, well, we're already on this route to being a quote-unquote peacekeeper, you know, how has that informed the rest of this, you know, road that the American people have gone down, even though they are war-weary from World War II. Vietnam happened, lasted for 2 decades. There was a lull, and then there were further subsequent occupations, and that leads to where we are now with Halliburton in the early 2000s of, you know, Afghanistan and the Middle East. So how do you see the military-industrial complex in its parallel to the art community and wealth building? And do you find that where do you stand on the support of arts through the funds that have been made and the wealth building that has been made through clandestine activity?
So I think I'll start with kind of talking about the way that we, wealth building through the military-industrial complex, and we'll get farther into that. And so I think really the way that we got here is that you look at even Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, we're talking about a war that can drive if it was a person. Like it's old enough to drive. And so the fact that we've reached that point makes you ask some questions about why are we still in Afghanistan? You know, and there's all these ideas about humanitarian aid, or that we're a great country that wants to help these people, but you don't help people by dropping bombs on them. You know, like that's not the way that you solve this problem. And so when you look at like this entire history of the military industrial complex, specifically like with Iraq and Afghanistan, when you look at like Halliburton and the way they were able to profit not only on like the weapon sales, but really on like little like everyday kind of objects that people needed to just live in, like the camps that they were like living in and things like, and you like kind of like uniforms and stuff like that too. So there's so much so much ephemera that kind of surrounds these wars, that there's massive amounts of money to be made off of them. And the longer they kind of persist, the more money is made. And I mean, go ahead and try to stop it. I mean, that's really the question. And so you look at that connected into the art world, you see people like Warren Kanders and like Safariland and his company, which was selling these like containers for like gas canisters and things at the border. And so these people are involved at every level of culture also. And so when you're looking at culture, you're seeing culture that's filtered through a lens that in a lot of ways is dominated by capital. And so for that capital to be involved in the art world means that you're also seeing artists who are being supported by capital. And so you're seeing an approved message. You know, in the same way that you're seeing an approved message if you're watching certain like news channels, or it's coming through a realm of this person's been hired for a reason. And so that's in a lot of ways why you, I think, see art that'll be kind of meaningless, or I'm kind of playing on that in my black abstract paintings. There's these moments where you get so deep into minimalism or into abstraction or into really figurative art. Now you kind of have these trends that it's all about the aesthetic of the work, and it's not necessarily about the deeper meaning that falls in underneath. And so, or to the extent that it is, it's about something that doesn't necessarily rankle people too much. You know, that there's certain topics that are off limits, and I think in a lot of ways this one is off limits. Which we're lucky to actually have the show here today. I mean, this is not easy to have a show that's about this kind of work and to actually have it be presented in a space where it's seen. And so to say that there's impact of capital in the art world is to also say that we really don't necessarily see all of the important art of our time, or that we don't see that art that is going to be important in 40 or 50 years because we've seen kind of the impact of the times that we've lived in, and it's clearer at that point. But maybe it wasn't sanctioned so like at the time, like people weren't so accepting of that type of work. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's highly intertwined in ways that when you even look at like museum boards or like collectors, it's that these people are oftentimes also benefiting from like incredible amounts of wealth that was maybe generated in nefarious ways. And the artists who are being supported by that, you have to ask questions about what they, why they're there. Yeah.
So to counter that, though, I mean, to play devil's advocate and counter that, what about working with a museum and taking those funds and creating a message like this exhibition and mounting it in a space and using their funds against that?
Right.
What side of where do you stand in that
I think
realm
it's,
when it comes to, yes, you've built it in a nefarious and clandestine way, and you know that's fine, but you've chosen to give.
Right.
And what we do with those funds is our business and is our museum's purpose to talk about these subjects.
Right.
Where do you land on the Warren Kanders argument and the Whitney and things like that?
I think it's important that on one end you have the museum, which is also being, some of this money is being funneled into that, and in some ways there are possible ways of kind of like of pushing these people out of those museums. So you saw that with actually Kanders specifically, and I do think that was
Sacklers.
Sacklers.
Museums refusing the funds.
Right, and seeing the way that applying pressure can push that out. But I also think when you have a stage that's sort of large enough and you know that enough people are going to see it, that it's important to put up a show if it will be seen. You know, and so I think if you can have a show that does question power, does speak truth to power, even if that power is within the same museum, it's important, or the same gallery or the same whatever, it's important to have that show and for people to see that, especially if there's going to be kind of this moment for an audience to see that work. The audience isn't connected to that money in a lot of ways, so that's different. But at the same time, like when you talk about like the Whitney Biennial or something, there's ways to apply pressure to the money that's being put in, and in some ways that, like, I think it was actually quite effective in that, like, you can now see all kinds of places online. You'll start to see kind of activist people who will go on, and they're artists also, and you end up kind of leaving that world because people have put so much pressure on people who have the money and who have the funds, and say, you can't be doing that. You know, like, you can't be in the art world and doing that. But and sometimes, so I think it's sort of situation dependent.
Do you think that the art world is one that is more critical
Yeah.
than others when it comes to that? I mean, often critique, art is an of-taste business, so, and critique is regular in arts critiques and things, and discussing the work and the influence of work and things. Do you think that in the art world, museums and museum goers and board members and things are open to that critique, or do you and willing to adhere and change their direction, or do you think that, you know, they're taking the critique and kind of just, okay, fine, dust it off, and I can handle it, you know, we can handle it, whatever?
I think it probably depends on the museum, and I think it probably depends on the person. But you know,
do you think it's solely an art world critique, though, or do you see institutions such as you know, various other nonprofits and corporate-supported initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways.
Divest also.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways you kind of end up having philanthropy and nonprofit sectors that sometimes do like great good, but they're also used as a way to sort of wash money. You know, to wash it as like less so in like an economic context, but more so in a like kind of social context, that you know, maybe this money was made through some kind of nefarious way, but you put it in a good place, and then people start to think positively of you. And so it's important that on the one hand you have like the opportunity to maybe pull out of like the Whitney Biennial or something, and to put pressure on people, but I do think that does extend outside of the art world. I mean, I think it permeates everything we live in. And I think that permeates especially the media that we see. I mean, it's when you look at the corporate control over so much of our, especially the TV media, I mean, I think that's, I mean, you're really getting approved media from a few sources.
Sure.
Whether they're on the left or the right, I mean, you're gonna get.
So let's kind of pull back a little bit and talk more kind of on your studio practice level. How do you balance object making, right? Paintings, drawings, installations, sculptures, with the research element.
Right.
And how active are both sides of your studio practice? Where are you spending your time? How are you spending your time in the studio?
I think so much of that is just like everybody has to kind of live and consume media, and that we kind of are doing that all the time, especially with social media. And so these things are just seeping kind of into me. You know, I'm like watching something on the news one day, and then I'm kind of thinking about it. I'm like, oh yeah, well these are crazy times to live in, and I think a lot of people feel that same way. And so these things are just kind of seeping into my practice. So it's not so much always that it's deliberate or that it's direct. It's more so that I've like seen these things in the world, and that I want to present them again in a visual form to other people. And so I think a lot of people then connect even to the abstract works because they're also filtered through that lens. And so once you have that lens, then you can kind of create works that follow in that same world. But I do think that in a lot of ways the sculptures are probably the closest distillation of a lot of those ideas. But the ideas really just come to me in the way that I'm like looking around the world, and I'm seeing things around me. And I think that's what all of us are doing on a daily basis now, is we're so like, getting so much information at once, we have to really process it. And for me, that processing is happening in the art. It's that I'm taking that with me to the studio, and that there's so much to be made of the things that are happening around me. And so, yeah, that's...
How do you balance the overt works that you make, such as, you know, the flag pieces, the installation piece, the redacted documents and things, with the more nuanced works, such as the line pieces or the blacked out paintings? How do you balance that? How do you find not losing the message? You know, because they are ultimately related. You know, when you came and spent time with our foundation, you were kind of at the peak of the flag paintings and the flag prints, and using the flag as a medium and a source of creating work. And then that informed these line works and the smaller drawings and the oil stick drawings and things like that. How, you know, something that's overt and then to something that's nuanced, how do you draw those parallels? Do they act, or are they going in parallel, or are they kind of traversing each other and kind of intersecting in some capacity?
I think they really intersect. It's really kind of messy. I mean, I have like, when I'm in my studio, you'll see kind of me working on like these paintings on one end, and then there's like a ton of boxes just full of like things that I've bought that I'm looking at, and I'm thinking like, okay, how am I going to adjust this object, or what needs to be done to this thing to make it read as something? And in a lot of ways, I think social media has helped me with that. That's one of the like really interesting things about having an audience both online and in person, is that, you know, it used to be sort of like you have an exhibition and you get some like response to that, or maybe you need to have like a critique with a bunch of other artists or something like that. I think now it's like I can post some art online and people can show up and maybe they look at it and then they're like, oh, well, I see what's happening here, or I don't understand, like, you know, why you're making this, and it takes a long time to kind of bring people into a range where they see these all as intertwined. And that's what's so exciting about like Instagram or about social media, is that I can make these works and have people see the paintings, and they're maybe attracted by the paintings. And then, you know, they follow around for about 4 or 5 months, and next thing you know, it's like, oh, I have these, like, I've seen these like sculptures you're making too, or I've seen these flag paintings, and they can kind of also like follow the story along, you know, and so that creates a different kind of dynamic than the kind of traditional way that I think a lot of artists have come up through just the gallery system, where it's what's in the show is what's in the show, and you don't necessarily have so much access. You know, I'm answering messages from people all over the world all the time, and to actually get their feedback is like hugely important. You know, I mean, I kind of always have like an open ear, and to be able to have that is to have so much information at my fingertips about whether something's reading as being connected to the other work or not, or if I get hate mail or, you know, things like that, and it kind of prepares me for the show. I know what I'm getting into, and so I think they're definitely intertwined, but it's kind of messy the ways that they're intertwined. It's all filtered through something else.
It's tangled.
Yeah,
tangled.
Exactly.
Interesting. So, you know, I want to go back to some of your influences and kind of how you work. And, you know, in the essay, I started talking about someone that you're heavily influenced, Anselm Kiefer, and kind of how he was working through concepts and still is working through concepts of a post-war identity. Yeah. So are you working in similar concepts, but in a post-American or post-violence or current violence identity? What does it mean to be American at this point in time? And how does that relate to, you know, the abstract expressionist movement, you know, and that being like a wholly American movement? So are you going into abstraction as a way of a coping element, you know, American Jewish life, things like that? Do you see it as a parallel, or do you see it as this neo-abstraction, neo-expressionism, things like that?
I think I kind of use the paintings almost as like a historical object to kind of reference back to a time period, like abstract expressionism specifically. So in a lot of ways, they're not just paintings, they're almost like sculptural references back to something. Like you would read them the same way that you would read the other pieces in the show, where they're like more, it's an object and not necessarily a picture plane. And so to think about abstract expressionism, like you said, is like a uniquely Jewish thing coming out of people like Clement Greenberg, coming out of the war. In a lot of ways, that's really like identity-oriented art. I mean, that's like uniquely coming out of like an incredible amount of trauma to a specific group. And I don't think it's always read that way in the art world. I think there's kind of some taboo about abstract expressionism, that it's like some old kind of fogey thing that maybe attracts a lot of people because it's pretty or something, but that we need to kind of remember that this work was really born out of the war. And so many of the critics and the originators of that work, and the extension, once you look out even further into like the Julian Schnabels of the world, who I don't know if he would say the same thing or not, he might not. But really, like looking forward through that arc, you see this like following of like cultural impact of abstract expressionism. And so I think that, yeah, it is about identity, and it is about also about American identity today, sure. I mean, you can't help but see the flag in it once you've seen the flag up here.
Right.
And so these works are all kind of connected to identity in some way, and to heritage and to history, but at the same time, they're being filtered through these sculptures. And so I think that's very important. There's no other way to see them than once you've seen the sculptures than to also see them as political objects. You can't kind of separate them out so much, because if they're all in the same space, it's like, oh, these things have to be connected. And so you start loading the abstraction with the sculptural meanings of those. And I think that kind of gets to a contemplative spot that people need to sort of think then about, well, okay, why is it abstract? Or like, what does abstraction mean?
Well, I mean, I think that leads to notions and abstract ideas and concepts that fall under the American flag and what the American flag stands for, what, identity stands for, what does it mean to be truly American, or what is Americana, things like that. I mean, it's multi-layered. And it's interesting that you work in the multiple layers of like creating prints and things like these monotypes here, or the documents that you're working with, layering multiple documents of redactions, which ultimately led to absolutely no information being shared in an information-ready age and an information-available age.
Right.
So, I mean, talk about the layers of not only conceptually, but how you're working in the studio. The layers within your studio, they are threaded together, but you're working in, high impasto painting, while simultaneously working in grease stick and charcoal and things like that.
Yeah, it's a very active studio. So there's a lot of kind of moving between drawing, and there will be just charcoal all over the floor. I mean, it's really like, when you walk through it, it's like dangerous if you have nice shoes on. I mean, you shouldn't do that. But really, so it will go from like having kind of these charcoal works, and I'm kind of stacking them up on top of each other. They oftentimes kind of end up they're dirty, I want them to be dirty, and kind of this like nasty object that you have to kind of really approach and not necessarily feel like they're like this pretty thing that I think a lot of abstraction is. And so at the same time, I've got the oil paintings usually happening on the wall, and so I'll be just covering them in massive amounts of gesso. I mean,
I saw some pieces that had color on the side of them too. So, almost all of your works, for much of the time that I've known you or known your work, it has been devoid of color. It's been black or white. And so, there's a couple of select pieces where I saw some like skin tone yellow, a little bit of blue. There's a little bit of kind of on the edge there. So how are you going from working in color and those different pigments and then kind of coming into that layer of black? Are you working over it? How does that, where does that come from? Where does it depart from and then
the black is the interesting part, I think. So I'll get to the color too, but the black kind of has a long history for me. So I started with those redacted paintings, and so obviously I'm having to paint it out in black and censor various different parts of the painting. And so I still kind of think of all of these works as being censored in some way. They're kind of like, the black is covering something up, like specifically with the flag works, it's like this, like the canvas almost has like a body or something, and you have these moments of the flag covering something. And what does that mean, that the flag is like literally being placed onto it and is maybe censoring something out in the same way that the abstract redacted pieces had been. Same thing for these abstract charcoal pieces too. And ultimately you get around to the black oil paintings, which are totally empty. So you have only one piece in this show that has words in it. So you get to Too Hot, and it's got some text right over there. And it really, I think that work is sort of the moment where I realized I could have text and censorship at once. And so as you enter the gallery, you probably can't read it. You probably can't see that Too Hot is happening there at all. And you kind of follow around the exhibition, and at the end of it, you've seen sort of these like black hole paintings that look like they're a void of some type, and then they're really totally like redacted or whatever you want to call it, censored. You get to the end and you've got something to engage with textually. And so that's where the black comes in the work. And I've found now that you can kind of load that black back in with that textual information that maybe was originally, the point was to lose it in the redaction. And so that in a lot of ways was then augmented, with this show specifically, the color in a lot of ways is really new. I haven't really worked very much with color at all. But I found, like, kind of out of necessity, really, that these objects, you know, they always have these colors involved in them, and that, you know, they really needed to have that. And so, like, I'm not going to paint them all black just for them to be black. I mean, there's no reason. I don't like have a spray can in my studio that I need to like paint everything black with. Right. So I found that these objects were maybe more powerful, that they still had like the colors that they were born with. And so, yeah, I think that it's important to be able to read those objects too, and for people to kind of approach them and yeah, the color is important, but it's only really important because it's what we automatically read within the object anyway. And I don't want to take that information away.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So you mentioned something about the text and being the only piece in the show that does have text that you created or that you're working with and is legible. Is that somewhere that you're heading?
Yes. But I won't tell you where.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
What's
but
next?
I would say yes.
What's next?
Next is I have a show in Cologne in April at Krupic Kersting Galerie, which I just actually had a show over there last year, last September. And we're planning a lot more conceptual sculpture for that show, and I'll have more abstraction there. There'll be all kinds of... I've been really moving in this direction of the oil paint. It's been exciting to kind of see that I have drawing and that there's a way to also translate maybe these drawings into oil paintings that I hadn't even really realized that they were maybe the drawings that would lead to this oil painting. Because I kind of had always thought of them as like standalone objects. And now I'm finding that they're almost preparatory. And so it's been really like a revelation for me to find that over the past like year or so.
So they're sketches. You're sketching for something.
Yeah, they're almost sketches, and it's wild because of the scale. Like I guess I need that scale even to kind of sketch it. And there's this immediacy to the drawing that there's just not to the oil painting.
Sure.
And so to be able to kind of translate those into oil paint is really exciting for me. So you can definitely look forward to more of that. There will be more text, and yeah, there will be more kind of political ventures. I definitely think that the military-industrial complex is something I'll be harping on for a long time, but also that I've got a lot of international interest too. That
so
looking at the way that the world is,
the perceptions of what the American military-industrial complex is.
Right, and there's a lot of areas to kind of explore that connect eventually, ultimately back to kind of the Aurora theater shooting and things that are very personal and the way that they relate to my like growing up. Right. So yeah, I think that's important too.
And you were, speaking of Aurora, so we'll rewind further from where we are now. You're from Aurora, but you weren't there when it happened. You had either just left or you were visiting and then just left or something. It was
I was in college at the time, but I was actually in Aurora when it happened.
That's right.
It was just that I wasn't at the theater though.
Yeah,
But I did know people who were at the theater. It was really just a horrifying time. I mean, you can kind of feel it in the air. it's like yeah, it's just
It's too close
really
for
too
comfort.
scary. Yeah,
Sure,
really.
sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that time was important, and looking back between that and, I mean, Columbine didn't happen far away, so I remember
Right.
kind of growing up and thinking that, like, it was normal to have so much security at the school, which I guess today it probably is because you see so many school shootings, but
Well,
I
I
mean, we
think
had,
that-
like, an incredible amount of security at, like,
That
my public elementary
normalization
school.
of
Yeah.
violence has
Yeah.
now become something that is
Yeah.
newsworthy, whether, you know,
Yeah.
it's in the news regularly,
regularly.
and that normalization of violence, I think, is something that is getting a little, you know, fatigued
Yeah.
as a viewer and as someone that is seeing this constantly
Yeah.
and
Especially on the
falling
micro
victim.
scale, because we often don't even hear about this
Right.
on the more macro kind of international scale, or like what our government is doing in other countries, or what's happening in Syria. You know, we don't hear so much about like Libya, or we don't hear so much about what's happening in Yemen and or how we're involved in those places.
Right. But we're hearing about the violence
but the
that
violence that's
is
happening
being
here.
created on the
Yeah,
home
on our
front,
own,
on
yeah.
our own behalf, to our
Yes.
own people.
Yeah.
And I think that lends note to the lack of support that, you know, American culture has for America to heal and help
Yeah.
heal and kind of
Yeah.
guide down that path.
Yeah, I think so too.
Well, thank you for taking the time and
Thank
making
you.
a beautiful show, and thank you to Nancy for hosting us and hosting this important show and such heavy topics and heavy work. I mean, not only visually, but also conceptually. So thank you.
And thank all of you. That's important. Thank you very much.
All right.
Yeah, nicely enough.
Yeah.